Would you please pray with me? O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be faithful to you. O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In the fall of 1935, Howard Thurman, the chaplain of Howard University, led a delegation of students from the United States to India, Burma, and what was then known as Ceylon, Sri Lanka. It was there at the College of Law at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka that Thurman gave a talk on civil rights in America. And afterwards, he was invited to join the principal of the law school for coffee in his office. And when they finished their coffee, the man asked Thurman, "What are you doing here? I know what the newspapers say about a pilgrimage of friendship and the rest, but that is not my question. What are you doing here?" This is what I mean. More than 300 years ago, your forefathers were taken from the western coast of Africa as slaves. The people who dealt in the slave traffic were Christians. One of your famous hymn writers, Sir John Newton, made his money from the sale of slaves to the New World. He is the man who wrote Amazing Grace. The name of one of the famous British slave vessels was Jesus. The men who bought the slaves were Christians. Christian ministers, quoting the Christian Apostle Paul, gave the sanction of religion to the system of slavery. Some 70 years or more ago, you were freed by a man who was not a professing Christian, but rather was the spearhead of certain political, social, and economic forces, the significance of which he himself did not understand. During the period since then, you have lived in a Christian nation in which you are segregated, lynched, and burned. Even in the church, I understand, there is segregation. One of my students went to your country and sent me a clipping about a Christian church in which the regular Sunday worship was interrupted so that they could join a mob against one of your fellows. When he had been caught and done to death, they came back to resume their worship of their Christian God. I am a Hindu. I do not understand. Here you are in my country, standing deep within the Christian faith and tradition. I do not wish to seem rude to you, but sir, I think that you are a traitor to the darker peoples of the earth. I am wondering what you, an intelligent man, can say in defense of your position. The conversation went on for more than 5 hours. And the result of that conversation, springing from this sympathetic Hindu's question, was Howard Thurman's seminal book, Jesus and the Disinherited. In this book, Thurman argues that within the Christian tradition, there has always been a powerful word of hope and liberation for those who are oppressed and marginalized, those whom Howard Thurman describes as people who live with their backs against the wall. But wealth and power, American exceptionalism, and white supremacy have contorted the gospel, twisted its meaning and message to support slavery and segregation, colonialism and patriarchy, heterosexism, capitalism, and militarism, until Jesus himself is no longer recognizable. Thurman sets out in his book to reclaim Jesus as religious subject, not just religious object. To place him in his historical context as a poor Jew living under Roman occupation and proclaiming an alternative spiritual reality that offers liberation to those who, like him, through the ages, are also oppressed and marginalized. Now, many of us are familiar with the Jesus movement of the 1990s and the theologians Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan and others who helped to reclaim the historical Jesus to a largely white, educated, progressive, mainline Protestant Christianity. I, like many of you, were steeped in this historical Jesus scholarship as an undergraduate student of religion at a mostly white, progressive, historically Methodist school in the South. But I had not heard of Howard Thurman. I didn't learn about him until seminary. I didn't know that decades before, a Black theologian descended from slaves who had grown up in the segregated South and had become the dean of the chapel at Boston University, had initially probed this historical Jesus for a message of hope for those who are dispossessed. For Thurman, the historical Jesus is not just an academic exercise, but an actual lifeline for those who live with their backs against the wall. I can count on the fingers of one hand, Thurman wrote, the number of times I have heard a sermon on the meaning of religion, of Christianity, to the person who stands with their back against the wall. And why is that, do you suppose? And what has been the result, not only for the church, but for those who live every day under the yoke of oppression, the threat of violence, the fear of death? In the introduction to the most recent version of Jesus and the Disinherited, published in 1996, Vincent Harding points out that for Thurman, writing in the 1940s, the church served as the central gathering place for Black people. The Black church provided refuge and strength, a place where people who were marginalized from the dominant society and culture could thrive. But today, at the close of Thurman's century, those people who live most obviously with their backs against the wall, the homeless, the working and jobless poor, the substance abused and abusers, the alienated, misguided, and essentially abandoned young people, are rarely within hearing or seeing range of the company of Jesus' proclaimed followers. The keepers of the faith of the Master often find it very difficult and very dangerous to follow him into the hard places inhabited by the disinherited in America, Harding writes. If we are being honest, we know that inside of most churches in America today is not where we are most likely to find Jesus. He is not in gilded cathedrals, but in tents pitched against the cold underneath city bridges. He's not alive in glorious stained glass, but amongst the broken bottles and discarded needles of the streets of the city. This is where we will find Jesus, who is not just an object of religious devotion, but a living source of truth and peace, of love and justice. This week, I was doing some street outreach with our unhoused neighbors, with Neil Christie and Gabby Pete from Georgetown Ministry Center. We walked around the neighborhoods of Georgetown and through the parks, calling out to people who were asleep in tents or panhandling on the streets of Georgetown and Foggy Bottom, or bundled up on the steps of public buildings. We offered them hand warmers and water bottles, invited them to take advantage of the showers and meals served at Georgetown Ministry Center. But most of all, we tried to engage them in conversation, to try to connect and build a relationship, and to treat them with dignity and respect, something that is in short supply when you live on the street. We visited with a group of people who have formed a small community near the Kennedy Center. When we approached this group of tents, we were greeted by a person named Juno, who introduced us to some of the other people there, acting as our ambassador. Juno shared that the people who live in this spot get food from the church across the street that houses Miriam's kitchen, and use the bathroom at a porta potty located near GW. Juno shared plans for the development of this little community, including a tent that would become a church. I wondered why they felt the need to create a tent church in their community when there was a brick and mortar church right across the street that fed them and offered them hospitality. Perhaps they didn't feel fully welcome there. Perhaps they would continue to feel like recipients of the church's charity rather than full participants and members of its community. I left with more questions that I hope one day I will get to ask Juno again. Because you see, in our gospel lesson today, there is where we find Jesus. Amongst the poor and the sick, with the unhoused and the hungry. Jesus leaves the synagogue and he goes out into the street, and as he travels throughout Galilee, people bring to him those who have various kinds of diseases, those who are in pain and possessed by demons, those with epilepsy and those who are paralyzed, and Jesus heals them. And when he begins to preach, the message he brings is one of great reversals. Those who grieve will rejoice. Those who are hungry will be filled. Those who are harassed and abused will find their reward in heaven. Jesus paints a picture of a future that will be different. But it's not a pie in the sky, by and by kind of message. Those who are poor and grieving and humble and hopeless and hungry and thirsty are also blessed here and now. Because in their poverty, in their grief, in their suffering, they are the ones closest to God. Now, people often categorize Howard Thurman as a mystic because the focus of his teaching and his life's ministry and his writing was on spiritual liberation. It's not that he didn't care about social injustice or that his teachings don't have any relevance on movements for social change. On the contrary, it is said that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used to carry a copy of Jesus and the Disinherited as he led the Montgomery bus boycotts. But for Thurman, liberation begins with a spiritual reality, a state of heart and soul. When we look at Jesus in his own time and place, Thurman points out that there were many faithful Jews who had various ways of coping with their experience of oppression. There were Sadducees who chose to assimilate with the dominant culture, Pharisees who simply chose to live in contempt of the Roman Empire but made no attempt to change it, and Zealots who were engaged in armed resistance. And then there was Jesus, who, according to Thurman, would not permit his oppressors to determine the quality of his inner life, and thereby give into their hands the keys of his destiny. Whenever Jesus' Spirit appears, Thurman writes, the oppressed gather fresh courage. For he announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that trail the disinherited, need have no dominion over them. In other words, they are blessed. Many of us can relate to the experience of having our backs against the wall at one point or another in our lives. Any one of us who has had the experience of being marginalized because of some aspect of our identity, our gender or our sexuality, our race or ethnicity, our economic class or immigration status, or our physical abilities. Things we cannot, that we would not change about ourselves. And yet, because of who we are rejected, discriminated against, pitied, overlooked, left behind. We can and we do fight for justice, for equality, and for social change. But we know that we also need to find within ourselves a sense of dignity and freedom that no one and no system can take from us. So much of our ministry here at Dumbarton with LGBTQ folks has been about this, proclaiming the sacred worth of all people, regardless of what the discriminatory laws and policies of the church may say. These experiences give us the ability to empathize with those who live their lives constantly backed against the wall. So as we begin this Lenten series, I want to invite us to enter into the teachings of Howard Thurman and his message to those who have their backs against the wall, with an awareness that by and large in this moment, we are not his intended audience. We are not the ones to whom Howard Thurman is writing. This is not a book that is centered on our experience. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that we don't have things to learn, that there isn't something from this Lenten series and through the teachings of Jesus and Thurman that we need to hear. In fact, I believe very strongly that there is a call in and through this good news for those who live with their backs against the wall, to us as well. Because the liberation of those who are most oppressed, the empowerment of those most dispossessed, the centering of those most marginalized in the story of Jesus means that there is also room for us. What does our religion, Christianity, say to those with their backs against the wall? That there is freedom and hope for all who live their life in Christ, not just for some. That there is a kingdom of God wide enough and deep enough that none are left out. And that because Jesus is there, with the poor, the disinherited, and the dispossessed, any of us can find him if we are only willing to go where he leads. May it be so. Thanks be to God.
Hello, good morning, Dumbartonians. First, want to thank Reverend Rachel for this invitation to talk about the impact of race on my life. I would also like to thank Elaine Friebel for her very thoughtful reflection on how race has intersected with her life. She grew up in Western North Carolina. I grew up in a few years ahead of her across the Smoky Mountains in East Tennessee. In both cases, much of our early lives were defined by segregation. Growing up, I was surrounded by only white people, with the exception of the custodian in my father's church. And when visiting relatives in Chattanooga and Alabama, when referring to black people, the best they could do was to refer to them as negatives. Despite graduating high school 9 years after the Brown decision in the Supreme Court, it was still segregated, and with a rebel mascot, Confederate flags were in abundance at every sporting event. I likely flew one myself as I sang Dixie. I do remember one occasion, it was the fall of 1960, and my mom had dragged me to a W.T. Grant store downtown Knoxville to shop for school clothes. Sit-ins had started in Greensboro that same year, but were still very new to Knoxville. Hungry for a sandwich, we sat down at a lunch counter and had ordered when a couple of very well-dressed black men sat down at the same lunch counter. Suddenly the waiter disappeared, the lights went out, the curtains were drawn, the store closed down. By no stretch of the imagination could my mother ever be accused of being a political or social activist. But she knew that what had just happened was wrong, and she told me to sit still while she went off to see the manager. I don't know what she said, but I know that she gave him a piece of her mind. And having been on the receiving end of that experience, I can attest to its potency. So we left the sandwiches untouched and walked out. Then back to my segregated life, including college, a small Methodist school in East Tennessee that had one black student, a commuter. Then along my senior year, a professor gave me a summer reading list that included Stride Toward Freedom by Dr. King, the man most responsible for changing my life. Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. Man-Child in a Promised Land by Claude Brown. Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. Black Like Me by John Howard Griffith. Motive Magazine. I was never the same. Haven't been the same since. Having slept through Dr. King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech, and having sold dictionaries through rural Georgia to sharecroppers in 1966, blissfully unaware of the civil rights movement churning all around me, I finally got woke. In seminary in Dallas in the fall of 1967, there was a laundromat not a mile from the SMU campus with a huge white-only sign that our freshman class undertook to picket every day. Honestly, I was grateful to the Dallas cops who actually helped protect us from the skinheads and Nazis who wanted to inflict some real damage. And then in April, on April the 4th, 6 o'clock in the evening, Dr. King was standing on the second floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel just outside his room, headed for dinner before attending a rally for striking sanitation workers. A single bullet fired from a flophouse across the street, and then everything changed again. I was stunned, numb, then overwhelmed with sadness, then anger, and then more pickets than ever showed up the next day as more than 100 cities went up in smoke. I felt ashamed to be a Southerner. I felt ashamed that 11 o'clock Sunday morning continued to be the most segregated hour in America. I spent the rest of my life trying to work out these contradictions. I also knew that demonizing my racist friends and relatives wasn't going to solve anything. That the tragedy of Southern history had fallen on our opponents as well as our allies. As Chris Hedges has written, on George Wallace and Bull Connors, as well as Rosa Parks and Fred Shuttlesworth. We are still coming to terms with the tragedy of our Southern history looking for redemption for everyone. Thank you very much. Amen.